when you look at life from the spiritual and the physics and the scientific lens, going back in time, what do you feel like was the predominant divorce between seeing physics and metaphysics as two separate things?
Mm, that's a great question. Actually, that's a big part of what, as I started my search to try and figure out how can science and spirit rejoin, how can they complement each other? It set me on a search that ultimately led me into studying alchemy again. And, as I was going through grad school and undergrad, the history that we would get in science is that the alchemists were a bunch of pseudoscientists who were just trying to turn lead into gold, and we know that can't be possible. So they were just, it was waved away as a sort of an embarrassment, if you will. But so my mindset was that, but it kept coming up synchronistically. It kept coming up, and the alchemists. So when I finally opened up my mind, because synchronicity just kept saying, "Look at this, look at this." As I looked at it, I realized, oh, that alchemy isn't what we were taught at all. This is actually a gold mine worth of wisdom, and it was the origin point of where science even came from. The alchemists were the original scientists, but when it was alchemy, science and spirit were interwoven. Like you couldn't separate the two of them, and it was very practical. So many of our forefathers of modern science were alchemists. Isaac Newton was a great example. Bohm. There's so many, and we separated at that time after the scientific revolution really came in. I would say. And it could have been before, it was a long, many hundreds of years worth of like trying to find the math and the science. But I think there was a political reason ultimately why science and spirit separated, because the church was the authority of all things spiritual in the European world anyway. And the alchemists wanted to be able to research and study and understand nature and the physical laws. But it was going against church dogma. So there was a reason why they had to sort of separate. They just said, like, look, let's leave anything spiritual to the authority of the church, and let us just research the physical world and how this works so that we can understand. Ultimately, their goal was to understand God's creation. But down the line, later, it became more and more and more secularized and more removed from anything spiritual. But it wasn't because there was a fundamental difference or conflict between spirit and physical or physics. It was more political.
Mm. It's interesting to see how that's rippled out into the mass consciousness and especially the Western mind. But what kind of world do you feel like we'd be living in if the emphasis wasn't solely mostly on sort of Newton's mechanistic models of reality, but maybe explores some of his theological and metaphysical and alchemical works?
Yeah, Isaac Newton, he wrote Principia, and that was like the big thing that all the laws of motion came off of. And it was one paper. But meanwhile, he had hundreds and hundreds of journals that were all about alchemy. And he even warned, the scientists and his fellow alchemists, like, don't take the divine out of the picture, right? And don't make the world a great machine. Don't make the universe a great machine. But that is exactly what they ended up doing. So I think that if we hadn't gone in that direction, if we had gone in the direction that Newton originally intended, we would probably be very much ahead. And in a way, I see that there was an alchemy within science itself, because the alchemical formula is to separate, purify, and recombine. And so it's almost like science had to go through its own phase of separation to really hone its craft and purify the way it operates. But now we're coming into this age where we need to recombine again, and bring the spirit back to the physics. So for me, when I was in physics, it was like, okay, our knowledge is advancing, our technology is advancing, and it's going to start. We're now in this exponential curve of rapid advancement that's happening. Within just 5 years from now, the world's going to be completely different than it is today, just based on science and technology. But unfortunately, our wisdom wasn't keeping pace with the advancement of the science and the knowledge, and therefore the way in which humanity is choosing to apply the knowledge and the power and the tools that we have available to us isn't necessarily towards the greatest good. And so I felt like it was more important for humanity to tap back into wisdom in order to bring the two together so that the wisdom could guide the scientific application, so that we can take these tools and technologies and this knowledge and power and apply it towards a greater good versus just the good of a few.
Hmm. For those that aren't familiar with the fundamental principles that were extracted in hindsight about Newton's Principia Mathematica and how that informed a lot of the direction we continue to explore from determinism to separability,
Mhm.
could you kind of illuminate what those four tenets were?
Sure. So the first one is determinism. It basically says that if we were given an initial set of conditions, we should be able to predetermine, based on the laws of science, all future evolution or all future progression of that initial state, right? So it's deterministic. Therefore, we can predict it, we can control it, we should be able to know what's going to happen next. The second is separation. They would look at every piece as separate from the others, and if I then and they also separated out mind, and spirit and whatnot from matter, right? So there was that separation that happened as well. And then, we take that and we go to the next one, which is reductionism. So if I take a whole thing and then I can break it down into its components and its different parts, and if I understand how each part works on its own, then I should just be able to sum them up and know how the whole works. But the problem with separation is it ignores all the interaction of things and the emergent phenomenon that comes out of those interactions and those relationships and the synergy and so forth. And then the fourth real principle that came out of the Newtonian science is realism. And realism kind of goes hand in hand with materialism, where it's saying that there is a real, physical, tangible, objective world that is the only thing, taken to an extreme, it says it's the only thing that's real is the material. And it would say then, therefore, that even consciousness and who we are is all just an epiphenomenon of physical processes. So those are the four major tenets of the Newtonian science. That goes back like 340 years. And then we kind of add, in terms of today's mindset, we added on to that Darwinian evolution, which was that sort of competition, survival of the fittest. And then you add on to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is also that you have to take care of survival first. Then you can start pursuing, more like education and purpose and self-realization and so forth. So those are like the major principles that got extracted from various scientific mindsets that have come to dominate our world, especially since the Industrial Revolution last, 100 years or so.